The 911 call came in at 2:17 in the morning on a humid September night in 2003. The dispatcher's voice remained steady and professional, but the recording captured something that would later make even seasoned park rangers uncomfortable. Heavy breathing, barely controlled panic, and in the background, something else. A low guttural sound that didn't belong to any animal listed in the field guides of Big Cypress National Preserve. The caller, a 34-year-old nature photographer named Marcus Webb, could barely form coherent sentences. Between gasps, he described something circling his tent. Something massive. Something that didn't move like a bear or a panther. His voice cracked when he mentioned the smell. A stench so overpowering he'd vomited twice while huddled in his sleeping bag, clutching a hunting knife with trembling hands. Rotting eggs mixed with decomposing garbage, he said, like death itself, had learned to walk upright. When rangers arrived 40 minutes later, they found Webb sitting in his truck, pale and shaking, refusing to approach his campsite until dawn. The tent had been partially collapsed. Massive handprints, far larger than any humans, pressed into the mud around the perimeter. And that smell still hung in the air, thick and nauseating, clinging to the vegetation like an invisible fog. Welcome to the domain of the skunk ape, Florida's most terrifying and enduring mystery. In the vast, unexplored wilderness of the Sunshine State's interior, where 700,000 acres of swampland stretch beyond the reach of civilization, something waits in the shadows. Something that has been seen, smelled, and feared for generations. The question that haunts every investigator who ventures into these dark waters remains unanswered. Are we tracking an undiscovered species of primate that evolution forgot? Or have we stumbled upon something far stranger? Something that defies everything we thought we knew about the natural world? In the places where cypress knees rise from black water and the canopy blocks out the sun, even at midday, the skunk ape legend thrives, fed by dozens of encounters, supported by photographs that experts cannot easily dismiss, and sustained by that unforgettable signature stench that turns skeptics into believers with a single breath. December 2000 brought an early Christmas gift to cryptozoologists, though it arrived wrapped in mystery and delivered by someone who would never step forward to claim credit. The photographs came to the Sarasota Sheriff's Department in a plain manila envelope, postmarked locally, containing 2 remarkable images and a handwritten letter that would reignite the skunk ape phenomenon with unprecedented intensity. The letter writer identified herself only as a concerned citizen living in Myakka City, a small community east of Sarasota, where sprawling properties give way to swampland and the wilderness presses close against human habitation. She wrote in a shaky hand, the careful script of someone from an earlier generation, explaining that something had been stealing apples from the basket she kept on her back porch. Not just taking them, she clarified, but coming night after night with what seemed like deliberate intent. 3 consecutive evenings, she had heard movement in her yard after dark, heavy footfalls that made her porch boards creak under considerable weight. On the 3rd night, she had positioned herself by the window with her camera, waiting. What she captured would become the most analyzed, debated, and celebrated photographic evidence in skunk ape history. The images showed a large, hair-covered figure crouching behind palmetto fronds at the edge of her property. Unlike the typical blurry, indistinct photos that plague cryptozoology, these pictures possessed a clarity that was almost shocking. The creature's face was visible, its features discernible. Dark eyes seemed to stare directly at the camera, caught in the moment before flight. Reddish-brown hair, matted and thick, covered what appeared to be a powerfully built frame. The palmetto fronds in the foreground provided scale, suggesting the figure stood well over 6 feet tall, even in its hunched position. But it was the details that made believers lean forward and skeptics pause before dismissing the images outright. The photographer had been close, perhaps 30 feet from her subject. The flash had illuminated the scene with harsh clarity, catching what appeared to be an expression on the creature's face, something between surprise and annoyance at being discovered. The hair showed individual strands in places, matted and dirty, hanging in clumps around the shoulders. One massive hand was visible, gripping a palmetto stem, fingers that appeared too long, too thick to be entirely human. The anonymous woman's letter continued with details that added credibility to her account. She mentioned the overwhelming smell that had accompanied these visits, a stench so powerful she had initially thought something had died in her yard. The odor of rotten eggs mixed with wet dog, with an underlying sweetness that made it even more nauseating. She described how her dogs, normally aggressive toward any intruder, had cowered inside the house, whimpering and refusing to go near the back door. She noted that the creature had moved with surprising quiet for something so large, and that after she took the photographs, it had simply melted back into the darkness, moving through the dense vegetation with barely a sound. The Sarasota Sheriff's Department found themselves in an unusual position. The photographs were compelling enough that they couldn't simply file them away. Deputy Jeff Lavallee was assigned to investigate, and what he found at the Myakka City property added layers to the mystery rather than resolving it. The woman's story checked out in the particulars. There was indeed a basket on her back porch, and the apples were gone. The vegetation behind her property line showed signs of recent passage, palmetto fronds bent and broken in a path leading deeper into the swampland. Most tellingly, there was the smell. Deputy Lavallee noted in his report that an unusual odor hung over the property, particularly concentrated near the tree line where the photographs had been taken. But the photographer herself remained elusive. She had made it clear in her letter that she did not wish to be identified or contacted. She was elderly, she explained, and feared ridicule from neighbors who already thought her eccentric. She wanted the authorities to have the evidence, to know that something unusual was prowling the area, but she wanted no part in whatever came next. The sheriff's department honored her request, redacting her name and address from all public documents, referring to her only as the Myakka photographer. When the photographs were released to the media, the response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets across Florida picked up the story, then national networks followed. The images were remarkable enough to transcend the usual dismissive treatment given to cryptid sightings. Here was something concrete, something that demanded explanation. Internet forums exploded with analysis and debate. The photographs were examined pixel by pixel, blown up, enhanced, compared against known animals and photographic hoaxes. Primatologists were brought into the discussion, and their reactions proved fascinating. Dr. David Bain, a specialist in great ape behavior at the University of Miami, studied the photographs with professional interest. He noted several features that troubled simple explanation. The hair pattern was unusual, he stated, not quite matching any known primate. The facial structure, while ape-like, had anomalies. The brow ridge was pronounced, similar to gorillas, but the overall skull shape seemed different. The body proportions, as far as could be determined from the photographs, didn't perfectly match orangutans, chimps, or gorillas. If this was a known primate, it was one displaying unusual characteristics. The escaped orangutan theory gained immediate traction among skeptics, and it had merit. The coloring of the creature's hair matched the reddish-brown of orangutans. Florida had several private facilities and roadside zoos, not all of them maintaining perfect security. An escaped orangutan would seek food, might raid a porch for apples, would certainly possess the strength and size to match the figure in the photographs. Law enforcement agencies checked with every facility housing primates within a 100-mile radius of Myakka City. None reported escapes or missing animals. Still, the possibility of an unreported escape, perhaps from a private collector keeping an illegal pet, couldn't be entirely dismissed. But believers pointed to specific anatomical differences that complicated the orangutan explanation. Orangutans have distinctive facial features, including prominent cheek pads in mature males, that create a disc-like appearance. The creature in the photographs lacked these pads. The body structure seemed more robust, less gangly than typical orangutans. The hand visible in one photograph appeared larger, with different proportions than orangutan hands. Most compellingly, orangutans are not known for raiding the same location multiple nights in succession with such apparent boldness. They are typically cautious around human habitation, and an escaped orangutan would likely be confused, frightened, and seeking to hide rather than systematically stealing apples from a porch. The investigation expanded beyond the initial property. Deputies canvassed the surrounding area, interviewing neighbors and residents of Myakka City. Several came forward with their own stories of unusual occurrences. Trash cans knocked over despite being secured with bungee cord, Strange calls in the night that didn't match known wildlife. One farmer reported finding massive footprints in the soft earth near his irrigation ditch. Prints that measured 14 inches long with a clear stride that suggested something walking upright. A fisherman claimed he had seen something large and hairy crossing a dirt road near Myakka River State Park, just a week before the photographs were taken. The public frenzy reached levels not seen since the early Skunk Ape reports of the 1970s. Weekend adventurers descended on Myakka City and the surrounding state park lands, hoping to catch their own glimpse or photograph of the creature. Local businesses capitalized on the attention, with restaurants offering skunk ape burgers and gift shops stocking up on cryptid memorabilia. The Myakka photographs became iconic, reproduced on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and bumper stickers. For a few bright months, the skunk ape felt more real than it had in decades. Photography experts weighed in on the technical aspects of the images. The photographs showed no obvious signs of manipulation, no telltale markers of composite images or costume fakery that experts had learned to recognize. The lighting was consistent, the shadows fell correctly, the grain and exposure matched what would be expected from a point-and-shoot camera with flash. If this was a hoax, it was an extraordinarily well-executed one. The photographer would have needed a remarkably convincing costume, an accomplice willing to brave the swampland at night, and the technical skill to stage photographs that could withstand professional scrutiny. The psychological profile of the photographer added to the mystery's allure. Here was someone who sought no fame, no profit, no attention whatsoever. She had sent the evidence anonymously, asking nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. This ran counter to the typical pattern of hoaxers, who generally sought the spotlight, craving validation or notoriety. Why go to the trouble of creating elaborate fake photographs only to refuse credit? The anonymity itself became a point in favor of authenticity for many researchers. As winter turned to spring in 2001, investigators made repeated attempts to follow up with the Myakka photographer. Letters sent to her address went unanswered. Deputies who drove by the property reported no signs of activity, and neighbors mentioned they hadn't seen the elderly woman in some time. Whether she had moved, passed away, or simply retreated further into privacy remained unknown. The sheriff's department eventually closed its active investigation, filing the case as unexplained, but with no evidence of criminal activity or public danger. And then, as mysteriously as they had begun, the sightings at the property stopped. No more missing apples. No more nocturnal visits. The overwhelming smell dissipated. Whatever had been drawn to that particular location, whether drawn by the apples or some other factor, had moved on or disappeared entirely. The sudden cessation of activity troubled both believers and skeptics. Had the creature been frightened away by the attention? Had it migrated to another area? Or had the photographer herself put an end to whatever had been happening, either by moving away or by some other means never disclosed? The Myakka photographs remain in the Sarasota Sheriff's Department files, occasionally pulled out when someone new takes an interest in the case. They have been analyzed by dozens of experts, debated in countless forums, and viewed by millions online. No consensus has ever emerged. To this day, they represent either the clearest photographic evidence of an unknown primate living in the Florida wilderness, or an elaborate mystery whose solution died with an elderly woman who took her secrets to the grave. The truth, like the photographer's identity, remains hidden behind the palmetto fronds, just out of reach. Long before the first European boots pressed into the sodden earth of the Florida Everglades, long before the first colonial maps labeled these wetlands as empty wilderness waiting to be tamed, the people who truly knew this land carried warnings in their oral traditions. The Seminole and Miccosukee tribes understood something that later settlers would dismiss with fatal arrogance, that the deepest reaches of the cypress swamps harbored more than alligators and water moccasins. They spoke of Esti Kapkaki, the tall man, the one who walks at the edge of vision, dwelling in places where even the most experienced hunters knew better than to venture. The elders would gather children around fires built on hammocks of dry land, small islands of safety in an ocean of sawgrass and black water, and they would share the stories passed down through generations uncounted. These were not tales meant to entertain. They were survival instructions wrapped in narrative, lessons that could mean the difference between returning home and disappearing into the green darkness forever. The old ones spoke of a creature that stood taller than any man, covered in hair the color of wet earth and Spanish moss, moving through the cypress domes with an impossible silence that defied its massive size. This being did not hunt humans for food, they explained, but it demanded respect for the sacred places, the deep water sanctuaries where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit realm grew thin as morning mist. Shamans within these tribes held specific knowledge about Estikapkaki that went beyond simple warning. They described the creature as a guardian spirit, a protector of the wetlands appointed by forces older than human memory. According to their teachings, the tall man appeared to those who violated the natural order, who took more than they needed, who showed contempt for the interconnected web of life that sustained the swamp. Hunters who killed wastefully might catch a glimpse of something massive moving parallel to their canoes, just beyond the curtain of hanging vines. Those who polluted sacred springs or disturbed nesting grounds during crucial seasons would smell it first, that distinctive odor that witnesses centuries later would struggle to describe, a combination of wet fur, decomposing vegetation, and something else, something that triggered an instinctive revulsion deep in the human brain. The tribal mothers taught their children a specific protocol that revealed the depth of their understanding. Never follow strange smells into the swamp, they instructed. If you catch a scent that makes your skin prickle, that draws you forward with curious dread, turn back immediately. The tall man uses such lures to lead the disrespectful deeper into his domain, into the cypress domes where the water runs black and still, where the canopy overhead blocks out the sun even at midday, where the roots of ancient trees twist into formations that disorient and confuse. Children who ignored this wisdom, the stories warned, were sometimes found days later, alive but changed, unable or unwilling to speak of what they had encountered in those primordial depths. The Seminole medicine men performed ceremonies at the boundaries of certain territories, areas they marked as belonging to the guardian spirit. These locations were not arbitrary. They corresponded to the oldest cypress stands, to sinkholes that plunged to unknown depths, to hammocks where rare orchids bloomed and panthers raised their young. The shamans would leave offerings of tobacco and cornmeal, respectful gestures acknowledging the tall man's dominion over these sacred grounds. They understood what later ecologists would confirm through scientific study, that certain areas of the Everglades formed crucial keystones in the ecosystem, places that if disturbed would cause cascading failures throughout the entire web of life. When European settlers began pushing into Florida during the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered these warnings with predictable contempt. The indigenous accounts were dismissed as superstition, primitive fear of the wilderness that civilized men would soon conquer and exploit. Survey teams mapping the wetlands for drainage and development heard the stories from their Seminole guides and laughed them off as quaint folklore, the sort of naive belief systems that progress would sweep away along with the swamps themselves. Military expeditions during the Seminole Wars noted in their journals that native fighters seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to vanish into certain areas of the Everglades, territories where even hardened soldiers felt an inexplicable reluctance to follow. Officers attributed this to tactical savvy and knowledge of the terrain, never considering that both the Seminole and their pursuers might be responding to the same ancient presence. Yet something remarkable happened as settlers established communities and began spending years in the Florida wilderness. The sightings they reported, though filtered through different cultural frameworks and described in different languages, matched the indigenous descriptions with eerie precision. Trappers working the remote wetlands in the 1800s began coming back with stories of massive bipedal figures glimpsed through morning fog, of camps visited during the night by something that left footprints too large to be human, too human to be bear. The smell was mentioned again and again in these accounts, that nauseating mixture that seemed designed by nature to trigger retreat. Pioneer families clearing land near cypress domes reported the same experiences that Seminole mothers had warned their children about for generations. The feeling of being watched from the tree line, the sounds of something large moving through underbrush, too thick for a man to penetrate, the occasional glimpse of a towering form that seemed to melt into shadows, and Spanish moss. What made these parallel accounts particularly striking was the geographic specificity. The areas where settlers reported encounters clustered around the same territories that indigenous people had marked as sacred grounds, the domains of the guardian spirit. Hunters who pushed into the deepest cypress domes, the ones their Seminole neighbors had warned them away from, came back with the most dramatic story. They described feelings of overwhelming dread in certain locations, a primal fear that made experienced frontiersmen abandon their traps and retreat to more familiar ground. Some never returned at all. Search parties would find their camps intact, fires still smoldering, but the men themselves vanished, as if the swamp had simply swallowed them whole. The cultural dismissal of indigenous knowledge created a strange historical amnesia. Each generation of settlers seemed to rediscover the presence in the swamp, as if for the first time, unaware that the warnings they now wished they had heeded had been offered freely decades or centuries earlier. Logging companies in the early 1900s sent crews into virgin cypress stands and found their workers refusing to enter certain groves, claiming they felt watched, that the shadows moved wrong, that smells emanated from the deep swamp, that made strong men physically ill. These were the same areas marked in Seminole oral maps as belonging to Kapkaki, but the corporate managers dismissing worker concerns as cowardice had no knowledge of that connection. Modern researchers examining the skunk ape phenomenon have begun to take the indigenous accounts seriously, recognizing them as potentially the longest continuous documentation of the creature's presence. When mapped carefully, the territories described in Seminole and Miccosukee traditions align remarkably well with contemporary sighting clusters. The deepest cypress domes, the ones that remain largely unexplored even today, continue to generate reports that echo the ancient warnings. Hikers describe the same sensation of being deliberately herded away from certain areas, the same nauseating smells, the same glimpses of something massive and hair-covered moving through terrain that should be impassable. This raises a profound question that cuts to the heart of the mystery. Is the skunk ape territorial, as the indigenous shamans believe? Does it actively protect specific sacred grounds, using intimidation and its overwhelming physical presence to keep humans away from areas it considers inviolate? The pattern of sightings suggests something more sophisticated than random animal behavior. Witnesses consistently report feeling that the creature wanted them to leave, that it was herding them back toward civilization rather than attacking or pursuing. This matches perfectly with the shamanic understanding of Kapkaki as a guardian rather than a predator, a being whose purpose is preservation rather than destruction. The sacred sites identified by tribal knowledge remain largely undisturbed to this day, not because of legal protection or conservation efforts, but because something about these places continues to repel human intrusion. Biologists studying these areas have documented their exceptional biodiversity, their role as refuges for endangered species, their function as crucial water filtration systems for the entire Everglades ecosystem. Whether through supernatural guardianship or through the accumulated wisdom of observing which areas most needed protection, the indigenous people marked for preservation exactly the territories that modern ecology would identify as irreplaceable. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this cultural history is what it suggests about human arrogance and the cost of dismissing knowledge we do not understand. The warnings were there all along, specific and detailed, offered by people who had coexisted with this presence for longer than written history can trace. Those warnings were ignored, and the encounters continued, generation after generation learning the same lessons through direct experience that they could have learned through respectful listening. The skunk ape, whether flesh and blood creature or something that defies easy categorization, has remained consistent in its behavior for centuries, protecting the same grounds, using the same methods, inspiring the same primal fear in all who venture too deep into its domain. The indigenous people understood this and encoded that understanding into their most sacred teachings. We are only now beginning to recognize the wisdom they tried to share. The Myakka River moves like dark glass through the palmetto scrublands of southwest Florida. Its tannic waters stained the color of sweet tea by centuries of decomposing vegetation. During the wet season, it sprawls into vast floodplains where cypress knees break the surface like arthritic fingers. But when drought comes, as it did with particular severity during the late 1990s and early 2000s, the river contracts, exposing mudflats and forcing everything that lives in those waters into tighter corridors. And according to numerous witnesses who experienced things along that waterway that they still cannot explain, the drought brought something else out of hiding as well. The clustering began in earnest during the summer of 1997, when Central Florida was entering the second year of a significant drought. Water levels had dropped nearly 3 feet below normal. Springs that usually gushed clear water had slowed to trickles. The Myakka, normally a lazy river wandering through wilderness, had narrowed considerably, concentrating both wildlife and whatever else might call those swamps home into smaller territories. That compression, some investigators would later theorize, might have been exactly what triggered the encounters. The Morrison family arrived at their favorite fishing spot on a Sunday morning in late July of 1997. Tom Morrison, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 sons had been coming to this particular bend in the river for over a decade. They knew every sandbar, every submerged log, every place where the channel catfish liked to congregate. They launched their 14-foot aluminum boat just after dawn, motoring upstream to a spot where the river deepened into a pool beneath overhanging oaks. The water was still chest-deep there despite the drought, dark and impenetrable as always. Tom killed the motor around 8:30 in the morning. The family settled into the comfortable rhythm of fishing, their lines in the water, conversation lazy in the building heat. Jennifer would later recall that the morning felt entirely normal for nearly 2 hours. They caught a few bluegill. The younger boy complained about mosquitoes. Standard summer Sunday on the Myakka. Then the smell reached them. Jennifer noticed it first, a pungent odor she described as similar to a wet dog, but stronger, more organic, touched with something that reminded her of rotting garbage. She asked if anyone else smelled it, and before anyone could answer, her husband pointed toward the opposite bank, about 40 yards away. Something was coming through the shallows. Not swimming. Walking. The water that was chest deep where they sat in their boat was apparently shallower near the bank, and whatever approached was moving through it upright, on 2 legs, pushing through water that came up to what would be its waist or thighs. Tom Morrison would later state in his report to the sheriff's department that his first thought was that someone else was fishing in waders, but this idea collapsed almost immediately. The figure was too tall, 7 feet at minimum, and massively built. The water displaced around it in visible waves. It moved with purpose, directly toward their boat. Jennifer grabbed the younger boy and pulled him close. The older son, 14 at the time, raised the camera they had brought to photograph any trophy catches, but his hands were shaking so badly that the resulting pictures showed only blurred streaks of vegetation and water. Tom Morrison reached for the motor's pull cord, yanked it twice, and miraculously, the engine caught on the second try. He twisted the throttle to full, and the little boat lurched downstream, away from whatever was wading through the Myakka toward them. As they fled, Jennifer looked back. She saw it clearly for perhaps 3 seconds, covered in dark hair, reddish-brown in the morning sun. Arms longer than any human's, swinging as it pushed forward through the water. A head that seemed to sit almost directly on massive shoulders, with very little neck visible. And the face, what she could see of it at that distance, looked wrong. Not quite human, not quite ape. Something that shouldn't exist walking upright through a Florida river on a Sunday morning in July. The Morrison family reached the boat landing in less than 10 minutes. Tom beached the boat, and they all scrambled up the bank to their truck, throwing gear into the bed without bothering to secure it. They drove directly to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office and filed a report that same afternoon. The deputy who took their statement noted that all 4 family members were visibly shaken. Jennifer was crying. The younger boy, only 9 years old, had become selectively mute and would not speak about what he had seen for nearly 6 months afterward. The deputy contacted the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and 2 days later a ranger named David Paulides was dispatched to investigate. Paulides had worked the Myakka River State Park and surrounding areas for 8 years. He knew the river, knew the wildlife, and considered himself reasonably familiar with what belonged in that ecosystem and what did not. He arrived at the location the Morrisons had described on a Wednesday morning, accessing the area from a different boat ramp to approach from downstream. The drought had intensified even in the few days since the encounter. What had been chest-deep water was now noticeably shallower, and long stretches of the riverbank that were usually submerged had become exposed mudflats. Paulides beached his boat and began walking the shoreline where the family had reported seeing the figure emerge. Within 20 minutes, he found the prints. They were in a stretch of soft mud about 15 feet from the current waterline, a series of 3 distinct impressions pressed deep into the riverbank. Each print measured 18 inches long, and 8 inches across at the widest point. 3 toes, clearly defined, with what appeared to be claw or nail marks visible at the tip of each digit. The stride length between prints measured roughly 5 feet. Paulides made detailed photographs with a standard 35mm camera, placing a ruler beside each print for scale. Then he mixed plaster and made casts of the 2 clearest impressions, a process that took nearly an hour in the heat. While the plaster set, he widened his search pattern and found something else. Caught on a low-hanging branch about 7 feet off the ground were several strands of coarse hair, dark reddish-brown, each strand between 6 and 8 inches long. He collected them carefully in evidence bags. The casts, once fully hardened and removed from the mud, showed remarkable detail. The 3 toes each bore a distinct pad pattern, unlike anything Paulides had seen in his years working with Florida wildlife. The depth of the impressions suggested a creature weighing somewhere between 500 and 700 pounds based on the soil consistency and compression patterns. But it was the gait that troubled him most. Whatever left these prints had been walking fully upright, bipedal, with a stride length that suggested legs considerably longer than any humans. He submitted both the hair samples and photographs of the casts to the State Wildlife Laboratory in Gainesville. The hair analysis came back 3 weeks later, with results that only deepened the mystery. The samples were mammalian, but could not be matched to any species in the lab's extensive database. The medulla pattern was unusual, the cuticle structure didn't align with known primates, and the coarseness suggested an animal adapted to wet environments. The technician who conducted the analysis noted in her report that the samples were inconsistent with any wildlife species native to Florida and recommended forwarding them to a larger facility for more detailed examination. Paulides wrote a comprehensive incident report and filed it with the state. The Morrison family received a copy confirming that physical evidence had been collected and analyzed, but no official explanation was ever provided. The case remained open but inactive, one more unexplained file in the archives. 14 months later, in September of 1998, the drought had worsened. Lake levels throughout central Florida had dropped to historic lows. The Myakka River, in some stretches, was running at less than half its normal flow. And on a Saturday night, 2 teenagers had an experience on a rural road paralleling the river that would leave them both traumatized. Kyle Henderson and Amy Reeves, both 17, were driving back from a movie in Sarasota, taking the long way through the back roads because they wanted more time together before curfew. The road they chose was State Road 742, a narrow 2-lane that winds through ranchland and patches of wild country before connecting back to the main highway. Very few houses, even fewer streetlights, miles of darkness broken only by headlights and stars. They were approximately 3 miles from the nearest intersection when Kyle's car began to lose power. The engine sputtered, the dashboard lights flickered, and despite his efforts to keep it running, the vehicle coasted to a stop on the shoulder. Complete electrical failure. The headlights died. The radio went silent. Even the interior dome light would not illuminate when they tried it. They sat in darkness so absolute that Amy later said she felt like they had been swallowed. Kyle tried the ignition repeatedly. Nothing. Not even the clicking sound of a dead battery. Just silence, and beyond the windows, the enormous darkness of rural Florida at night. Then the smell reached them through the car's air vents. That same pungent odor the Morrison family had described. Wet animal, organic decay, overwhelming in its intensity, even inside the closed vehicle. Amy reached for Kyle's hand. They sat frozen, breathing through their mouths, trying to understand what was happening. The figure crossed in front of the car from the passenger side to the driver's side. It moved through the space where the headlights would have been shining if the electrical system had been functioning, close enough that both teenagers could see it clearly in the ambient starlight. Massively tall, perhaps 8 feet, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb what little light existed. It walked upright on 2 legs, arms swinging, head turning briefly toward the car as it passed. Amy saw the eyes catch some distant reflection and shine back amber green for just an instant. Then it was gone, disappearing into the palmetto scrub on the driver's side of the road. They sat in shocked silence for perhaps 30 seconds. Then the car's electrical system suddenly restored itself. Dashboard lights blazed on. The radio erupted with music at whatever volume they had left it. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. Kyle turned the key and the engine started immediately, running smoothly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. He put the car in gear, and they drove home going 20 miles per hour over the speed limit, neither of them speaking until they reached the lights and traffic of the main highway. Amy was crying silently, tears running down her face as she stared straight ahead. Kyle's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. They did not report the encounter to police. They told their parents they had been frightened by someone suspicious on a dark road, which was true enough in its way. But they told each other the full truth, and they told one other person as well. Kyle's older brother was dating a woman who worked as a dispatcher for the State Park Service. She listened to their story, believed them, and quietly passed the information to David Paulides, the same ranger who had investigated the Morrison sighting. Paulides met with Kyle and Amy separately and together, documenting their accounts in unofficial notes he kept in a personal file. He drove to the location they described and searched the area, but found no physical evidence. The road shoulder was mostly grass and scattered gravel, not conducive to holding prints. But he noted the location carefully, and when he compared it to his growing collection of encounter sites, a pattern began to emerge. Every reported sighting clustered along the Myakka River corridor. Every encounter occurred during drought years, when water levels were significantly below normal. And several witnesses mentioned electrical interference, battery failures, or equipment malfunctions occurring simultaneously with the sightings. Between 1997 and 2003, Paulides collected reports of 11 separate encounters along the Myakka River system. Not all were as detailed as the Morrison family sighting or the teenagers' experience, but all shared common elements. Bipedal figures, massively built, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. A distinctive, pungent odor. Behavior that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random wildlife movement. In 2001, during another severe drought, a bow hunter named Marcus Webb was in a tree stand about 2 miles from where the Morrison family had their encounter when he heard vocalizations unlike anything in his 20 years of hunting Florida game. Deep guttural sounds, almost like speech, but with tonal qualities no human voice could produce. He had a micro cassette recorder in his pack that he used to log deer movement times. He turned it on and captured nearly 4 minutes of the sounds before whatever was making them moved away through the undergrowth. Webb brought the recording to Paulides, who made copies before submitting the original to wildlife acoustic specialists at the University of Florida. The analysis report noted that the vocalizations contained frequencies and harmonic structures inconsistent with known Florida wildlife, including bears, panthers, alligators, or any primate species. The sounds demonstrated what the specialists called apparent intentional communication with repeated phrase-like structures, but could not be matched to any animal in their acoustic database. The psychological impact on witnesses varied, but was uniformly significant. The Morrison family sold their fishing boat 2 months after their encounter and never returned to the Myakka River. Jennifer Morrison developed anxiety severe enough to require medication when anyone suggested outdoor activities. Their younger son required counseling for over a year. Amy Rees experienced recurring nightmares about the figure crossing in front of the car. She refused to drive on dark rural roads for the rest of her teenage years and into adulthood. Kyle Henderson developed a compulsive need to check that his car doors were locked, sometimes verifying the locks a dozen times before he could leave a vehicle. Marcus Webb, the hunter who recorded the vocalizations, continued hunting but never returned to that particular section of the river corridor. He told Paulides in a follow-up interview that he felt something had changed for him in those moments when he heard those sounds. Some fundamental sense of security about his place in the natural world had been shaken. He knew that something large and unknown shared the same wilderness he had considered his private domain, and that knowledge made every shadow different, every sound suspect. One witness, whose name Paulides kept confidential at her request, moved out of state entirely. She had encountered something while kayaking alone on the upper Myakka in 2002. Whatever she saw frightened her badly enough that she relocated to North Carolina within 3 months, selling her house at a loss rather than stay in the area. Paulides spoke with her once by phone after her move. She would not discuss details but simply stated that she knew what she had seen and could not live in a place where such things existed. The pattern Paulides found most disturbing was the correlation with drought conditions. When he plotted encounter dates against hydrological data from the Southwest Florida Water Management District, the relationship became undeniable. Sightings spiked when the Myakka River system contracted to 70% or less of normal flow. During wet years, when the river sprawled wide and the swamps became nearly impenetrable, reports dropped to almost zero. His theory, documented in his personal files but never officially published, was that something lived in the deepest parts of the Myakka River swamp system, in areas so remote and waterlogged that even experienced outdoorsmen rarely penetrated them. During normal and wet conditions, these creatures remained in their deep refuge, with enough territory and resources to avoid human contact. But when drought compressed the available habitat, they were forced into areas closer to human activity, forced to cross roads looking for water, forced to wade through fishing spots searching for food, forced into visibility when they would otherwise remain hidden in the deep swamp. It was an elegant theory that explained the clustering, the timing, the apparent increase in encounters during specific years, but it also carried unsettling implications. It suggested a breeding population, not a single animal. It suggested intelligence and adaptability sufficient to avoid detection most of the time. And it suggested that somewhere in the vast wild area surrounding the Myakka River, something unknown continued to exist, invisible until circumstance forced it briefly into the light. The physical evidence remained inconclusive but compelling. The plaster casts with their three-toed impressions, the unidentifiable hair samples, the acoustic recordings that matched nothing in scientific databases, photographs and documentation spread across years, and multiple witnesses who had never met each other but described nearly identical experiences. The encounters along the Myakka River corridor between 1997 and 2003 remain unexplained. The evidence was collected, analyzed, and filed. The witnesses gave their statements and tried to move forward with the weight of what they had seen. And somewhere along that dark water that moves through the palmetto country, in the deep places where the swamp becomes nearly impenetrable, something may still be waiting for the next drought to push it once again from deeper refuge into the edges of the human world. The Tamiami Trail cuts through the heart of the Everglades, like a scar across ancient skin, and at mile marker 70 in the nearly abandoned settlement of Ochopee stands a weather-beaten compound that looks more like the remnants of a fever dream than a legitimate research facility. Hand-painted signs advertising airboat tours and Skunk Ape souvenirs lean against cypress posts, faded by decades of merciless Florida sun. Night. This is the Skunk Ape Research Headquarters, and it's here that Dave Shealy has spent more than 30 years of his life hunting something that most people believe doesn't exist. Shealy didn't stumble into this obsession. He was born into it. His family has deep roots in the Everglades, going back generations to the early settlers who carved out impossible lives in the swamp. According to Shealy, he was only 10 years old when he had his first encounter, fishing with his brother in the pre-dawn darkness of the wetlands. He describes seeing a massive figure, dark and hulking, moving through the sawgrass with an intelligence that separated it from any bear or other known animal. The moment imprinted itself on him with the permanence of trauma, reshaping the entire trajectory of his existence. What makes Shealy different from casual enthusiasts or weekend cryptid hunters is the totality of his commitment. This isn't a hobby pursued in spare moments between a regular job and family obligations. The Skunk Ape became his job, his identity, his entire reason for being. He transformed his property into a living monument to his quest, creating a peculiar hybrid of research station and roadside attraction that confuses the categories people use to make sense of the world. Is it a serious scientific endeavor or a tourist trap? The answer, uncomfortably, might be both. The centerpiece of Shealy's credibility, or his notoriety depending on who's telling the story, arrived in the year 2000. Armed with a video camera, Shealy captured footage that would define his life and divide opinion for decades to come. The video shows a large, dark figure moving through a stand of palmettos, approximately 150 yards from his position. The creature appears massive, covered in dark hair, moving with a gait that Shealy insists is neither human nor any known Florida wildlife. The footage is shaky, distant, and brief, exactly the kind of evidence that drives skeptics into fits of frustrated dismissal. Critics attack the footage immediately and mercilessly. The figure is too far away for definitive identification, they argued. The quality is too poor. The movement could be explained by a person in a suit, or even misidentified wildlife seen through the distorting lens of expectation and poor visibility. Professional wildlife biologists pointed out that black bears, though rare in South Florida, do occasionally wander through the Everglades, and their behavior when startled can seem remarkably unusual to the untrained eye. The speed with which skeptics mobilized to discredit the footage revealed something about the cultural anxiety surrounding cryptid claims, the desperate need to maintain the boundary between known and unknown. But Shealy has never wavered. He defends the footage with the conviction of someone who knows what he saw, who was there in the thick humidity and mosquito clouds of the actual moment, not sitting comfortably in an air-conditioned office analyzing pixels. He points to details in the movement, the way the figure navigates the dense vegetation, the proportions visible even at a distance. He studied the footage frame by frame for more than 2 decades, and rather than finding flaws that shake his certainty, he sees confirmation with each viewing. The video alone might have been dismissed as a one-time claim, but Shealy's story extends far beyond a single piece of controversial evidence. He speaks of multiple personal encounters spread across the years, experiences that have shaped his understanding of the creature's behavior and intelligence. The most dramatic, the one he recounts with a particular intensity that suggests the memory remains viscerally alive, occurred when he claims to have found himself only 15 feet from a skunk ape. He describes the encounter in specific, sensory detail. The overwhelming odor that gives the creature its name, a stench he compares to rotten eggs mixed with wet dog and something else. Something uniquely foul that has no adequate comparison in normal experience. The sound of breathing, heavy and deliberate, coming from something large, lunged and powerful. The awareness of being in the presence of something that could kill him effortlessly if it chose to. The primitive fear response that overrides rational thought. He froze, he says, not from a conscious decision, but from the body's ancient wisdom when confronted with an apex predator. The creature observed him for what felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, then moved away through the vegetation with surprising quietness for something of its alleged size. Skeptics have a field day with these claimed encounters. No photographs from 15 feet away? No physical evidence collected? Just another story, they say, convenient and unprovable. The pattern fits too neatly with cryptid encounter narratives worldwide, the close call that somehow never produces definitive proof. But Shealy's defenders point out that terror and presence of mind rarely coexist. Fight or flight responses don't include reaching for a camera. The body's priority is survival, not documentation. To address the evidence problem, Shealy has developed an elaborate network of trail cameras throughout the Everglades, dozens of devices positioned at locations determined by his years of tracking experience. He's studied patterns of sightings reported by others, analyzed vegetation and water sources, identified what he believes are travel routes through the wetlands. The camera network represents not just financial investment, which has been considerable, but thousands of hours of work in brutal conditions, wading through swamps, fighting vegetation and wildlife, positioning equipment in remote locations that require hours to reach. This is where the story takes a turn into genuinely unsettling territory, regardless of one's beliefs about the skunk ape itself. Shealy has documented extensive, inexplicable damage to his cameras in remote locations. Scratched lenses that show deliberate gouging patterns, not the random damage from weather or falling branches. Torn straps, ripped with force that suggests strength and intention. Devices moved from their carefully chosen positions, sometimes found yards away from where they were installed, facing different directions. Cameras mounted 10 or 12 feet high, found on the ground, intact but clearly removed rather than fallen. The pattern of damage suggests something beyond random vandalism or animal interference. Bears might knock down a camera, but they don't consistently scratch lenses while leaving the rest of the device functional. Humans could sabotage equipment, but these locations require significant effort to reach, and there's no clear motive for someone to repeatedly hike hours into the swamp, just to damage cameras in ways that suggest awareness rather than destruction. The cameras aren't stolen for their value. They're tampered with, almost as if something is expressing disapproval of being watched, asserting dominance over the surveillance system. Shealy interprets this as evidence of intelligence, proof that something in the Everglades understands what cameras are and doesn't want to be recorded. Critics counter that he's pattern-seeking, attributing meaning to random damage and equipment failures that are inevitable when placing sensitive electronics in harsh environments. But the counter-argument requires believing in a remarkable string of coincidences. Damage that repeatedly occurs in specific patterns to cameras, positioned in areas Shealy has identified as potential skunk ape territory. The Skunk Ape Research Headquarters itself embodies the central contradiction of Shealy's life. It functions as a tourist attraction, complete with a gift shop selling t-shirts, bumper stickers, and various skunk ape memorabilia. Visitors can take airboat tours with Shealy or his associates, hear stories, see the famous video footage, and purchase tangible reminders of their brush with cryptid culture. The commercial aspect invites obvious accusations of exploitation, of profiting from perpetuating a hoax, or, at minimum, capitalizing on local legend without regard for truth. But here's the uncomfortable reality that complicates the simple hoaxer narrative. Shealy hasn't gotten rich from this enterprise. The Skunk Ape Research Headquarters exists in a constant state of barely getting by. This isn't a slick operation with corporate backing and marketing departments. It's a ramshackle collection of buildings held together by determination and duct tape. If this is a con, it's the most financially unsuccessful con in the history of fraud. Shealy could have pursued any number of more profitable ventures with the skills he's developed, the tracking expertise, the knowledge of the Everglades ecosystem. Instead, he's chosen a path of financial instability in service of a quest that consumes everything. Those who know Shealy personally often comment on his legitimate expertise. Whatever else might be true, he knows the Everglades with the intimacy of someone who's spent a lifetime in intimate contact with the landscape. He can read signs in the mud, interpret patterns of vegetation disturbance, navigate terrain that would kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. His tracking skills are genuine, acknowledged even by critics who dismiss his conclusions. This raises the question of whether someone with real expertise could be so thoroughly wrong about what he's tracking, or whether his skills lend credence to claims that would otherwise be easier to dismiss. The psychological dimension of Shealy's story cuts deeper than simple questions of evidence and credibility. This is a man who has structured his entire adult life around proving something to a world that largely doesn't want to be convinced. He's endured decades of mockery, dismissal, and accusations of fraud. He sacrificed financial security, conventional success, perhaps relationships and opportunities that required him to be something other than the skunk ape guy. The level of commitment reveals either profound delusion or profound conviction, and the line between those states can be remarkably thin. There's something both admirable and tragic in Shealy's dedication. Admirable because it represents the pure human impulse toward discovery, the refusal to accept consensus reality when personal experience suggests something more. Tragic because the nature of cryptid hunting almost guarantees that definitive proof will remain elusive, that the quest becomes its own justification regardless of outcome. Shealy has backed himself into a corner where his entire identity depends on the skunk ape's existence. What happens to a person who's invested everything in a claim that may be unprovable? The story of Dave Shealy and his Skunk Ape Research Headquarters holds up a mirror to our complicated relationship with mystery. We're fascinated by the unknown, drawn to it in books and films and late-night conversations. But when someone actually dedicates their life to pursuing it, we don't quite know what to make of them. Are they brave explorers or deluded fools? The answer probably says more about us than it does about them. In the end, Shealy continues his work in the Everglades, checking his cameras, following tracks, waiting for the encounter that will finally prove to everyone else what he already knows. And somewhere in the palmetto thickets and cypress swamps, something may be watching back, aware of the cameras, and deliberately staying just beyond the reach of proof. The swamps of Big Cypress National Preserve in southern Florida hold secrets in their dark waters and endless sawgrass marshes. During the winter of 2008, these wetlands claimed another victim. But the circumstances surrounding this disappearance would trouble investigators and haunt search and rescue teams for years to come. What happened to Marcus Webb remains one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in the preserve's history, a mystery that defies the official explanations and leaves behind more questions than answers. Marcus Webb was not the type of man who made careless mistakes in the wilderness. At 42 years old, he had spent more than 2 decades exploring some of the most challenging environments in North America. Friends and family described him as meticulous, experienced, and deeply respectful of nature's dangers. He had guided tours through the Everglades, had spent months camping in remote sections of the Appalachian Trail, and had even survived a close encounter with a black bear in the Great Smoky Mountains through calm, knowledgeable action. The Big Cypress National Preserve was familiar territory to him. He had camped there at least a dozen times before, always returning with stories and photographs, but never with incidents that raised concern. In early February of 2008, Marcus informed his wife Jennifer that he would be undertaking a 5-day solo camping trip in a remote section of the preserve near the Lopez River area. This was not unusual behavior for Marcus. He often sought solitude in the wilderness, viewing these expeditions as both spiritual retreats and opportunities to practice his survival skills. Jennifer Webb later told investigators that her husband seemed excited about the trip, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. He packed his gear with his characteristic thoroughness, checking and rechecking his supplies, his water purification equipment, his first aid kit, and his rifles. Yes, he carried 2 firearms on these trips, a hunting rifle and a handgun, both of which he was licensed to carry and experienced in using. He planned to return on February 9th, a Saturday, in time for his daughter's birthday celebration that evening. When Marcus failed to return by sunset on the 9th, Jennifer waited until midnight before contacting authorities. She knew her husband well enough to understand that delays could happen in the wilderness, but she also knew that Marcus would never miss his daughter's birthday without finding a way to send word. By dawn on February 10th, a search and rescue operation was underway. The search team located Marcus Webb's campsite on the afternoon of February 11th, and what they found there immediately transformed the operation from a routine rescue mission into something far more troubling. The campsite was in complete disarray, a scene that veteran search and rescue coordinator Thomas Delacroix later described as unlike anything he had encountered in 23 years of service. The tent had been collapsed, but not in the way a tent falls when weather or animals interfere with it. The support poles were snapped, and the fabric was torn in several places. Marcus's supplies were scattered across an area spanning roughly 30 feet, strewn about as if thrown or knocked aside in panic or violence. Food containers were opened and emptied, though not consumed. Camping equipment lay damaged and displaced. Most disturbing to the search team was the discovery of clear evidence that Marcus's hunting rifle had been discharged. Spent shell casings were found near the tent, 3 of them, indicating that Marcus had fired multiple times. However, the rifle itself was never recovered from the scene. Delacroix ordered his team to expand the search perimeter and look for any signs of Marcus, whether tracks, blood, torn clothing, or worse. What they discovered instead defied easy explanation and would become the most controversial aspect of the entire investigation. Circling the campsite, pressed deep into the soft earth and mud, were footprints. But these were not the boot prints of Marcus Webb, nor were they the paw prints of any known animal in the region. The impressions were massive, measuring between 14 and 16 inches in length according to the official report, and roughly 7 inches wide. They appeared to be bipedal, showing what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions and a heel strike pattern that suggested an upright walking gait. The depth of the impressions indicated substantial weight, far heavier than a human being would produce. Search team member Patricia Moreno, a wildlife tracker with extensive experience identifying animal signs, examined the prints carefully. In her testimony to investigators, she stated that she could not reconcile what she was seeing with any known species in the area. Black bears occasionally venture into Big Cypress, but these prints bore no resemblance to bear tracks, lacking the claw marks and shape characteristic of ursine species. The stride length between prints measured approximately 5 feet, far longer than a human stride and inconsistent with any quadrupedal animal moving on hind legs. The footprints circled the entire campsite, some overlapping, suggesting that whatever made them had moved around the area multiple times. The trail of prints led away from the camp heading southwest, directly into one of the most impenetrable sections of sawgrass marsh in the preserve. The search team attempted to follow, but within 200 yards, the trail became impossible to track as the ground transitioned to shallow water and dense vegetation. However, The disturbing evidence at the campsite did not end with the mysterious footprints. Multiple members of the search team reported an overwhelming stench in the area surrounding Marcus's camp. The smell was described consistently by different team members as putrid, like rotting flesh or decay, but with a quality that none of them could quite articulate. The odor was strongest near where the footprint trail led into the marsh, and it seemed to intensify as the afternoon wore on. Some team members experienced nausea and headaches, which they attributed to the smell. As daylight faded on February 11th, Delacroix made the decision to establish a base camp near the site and continue the search through the night using floodlights and thermal imaging equipment. This is when the situation took an even more unsettling turn. Beginning around 8 in the evening, members of the search team began hearing vocalizations coming from the swamp. The sounds were described in various ways by different witnesses, but certain consistent elements emerged from their testimonies. The vocalizations were loud, carrying easily across the wetlands despite the dampening effect of vegetation. They were not sounds that anyone on the team recognized as belonging to known animals in the area. Several team members described them as similar to howling, but deeper and more guttural than wolf or coyote calls. Others described whooping sounds, or what one team member called a combination of screaming and roaring that made the hair stand up on the back of her neck. Patricia Moreno recorded audio on her personal device during one of these episodes. The recording, later analyzed by wildlife experts, captured approximately 45 seconds of vocalizations that were officially classified as unidentified. Biologists who reviewed the audio could not attribute the sounds to alligators, birds, big cats, or any combination of known species in the region. The vocalizations continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes seeming to come from different locations, as if multiple sources were calling back and forth to each other across the preserve. Team members reported feeling increasingly uneasy, a sensation that Thomas Delacroix acknowledged in his official report, noting that the combination of the disturbing campsite evidence, the unexplained footprints, the pervasive stench, and now these unsettling sounds created an atmosphere that was affecting team morale and operational effectiveness. By 3 in the morning, on February 12th, Delacroix made the controversial decision to temporarily withdraw the search team from the immediate area. In his statement, he cited safety concerns and the need to regroup and develop a more comprehensive search strategy. However, several team members later admitted in unofficial conversations that the decision came as a relief, that the atmosphere in that section of the preserve had become genuinely frightening in a way that experienced wilderness professionals rarely encounter. The search resumed at dawn with additional personnel and equipment, including helicopter support and cadaver dogs. Despite these resources and several more days of intensive searching, no trace of Marcus Webb was ever found. No body, no additional evidence, no signs of where he might have gone after leaving his campsite. During the investigation phase following the search, authorities discovered Marcus's journal inside the collapsed tent. The journal was standard equipment for him on these trips, a place where he recorded observations about wildlife, weather patterns, and his own thoughts during his time in solitude. The entries from this particular trip were routine and unremarkable until the final entry, dated February 8th, the night before he was supposed to begin his return journey. The final entry in Marcus Webb's journal has been the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. In it, he described feeling uneasy that evening, a sensation he acknowledged was unusual for him. He wrote about noticing a smell in the air after sunset, describing it as a death smell, like something large had died nearby and was decomposing. He wrote that he considered moving his camp but decided against it as darkness was already falling. Then, in what would be his last written words, Marcus described seeing something at the tree line approximately 50 yards from his tent. He wrote that there was something large watching him from the shadows between the cypress trees. He noted that he could not make out details in the failing light, but that he had the distinct impression of being observed by something that was studying him with clear intent. He wrote that the smell had grown stronger, almost unbearable, and that he was keeping his rifle close. The entry ended mid-sentence, the final words reading, "It's moving closer," and "Liu, out." The journal was found open to this page, lying on top of Marcus's sleeping bag as if he had set it down suddenly. There were no additional entries, no completion of that final thought. The official investigation concluded after 3 weeks. The final report listed Marcus Webb's disappearance as an accidental death, most likely due to exposure or an alligator attack. with the note that the body had not been recovered, which is not uncommon in the extensive wetlands of Big Cypress where remains can be quickly scattered or submerged. The disturbing elements of the case, the footprints, the discharged rifle, the stench, the vocalizations, were acknowledged in the report, but attributed to a combination of known wildlife activity, possible bear presence, and the stress-induced perceptions of search team members working in challenging conditions. This official conclusion satisfied no one who was closely involved with the case, least of all Marcus Webb's family. Jennifer Webb publicly disputed the findings, stating that her husband was far too experienced to die from exposure or to be caught unaware by an alligator. She pointed to the evidence of the rifle being fired, asking what he was shooting at and why the weapon was never found. She demanded further investigation into the unidentified footprints, which she believed were the key to understanding what happened to her husband. Local residents and frequent visitors to Big Cypress began sharing their own experiences in the area where Marcus disappeared. Several hikers came forward to report that they too had felt watched in that particular section of the preserve, describing an oppressive sensation of being observed by something unseen. Others reported strange smells and unusual sounds, though none had experienced anything as dramatic or conclusive as what the search team encountered. In the years since Marcus Webb's disappearance, that area of Big Cypress has developed a reputation among those who know the story. Some people avoid it entirely, while others are drawn to it precisely because of the mystery. Trail markers and GPS coordinates for the site have been shared online, though the National Park Service does not officially acknowledge any special significance to the location. Rangers who work in the preserve offer varying perspectives on the case. Some maintain that the official explanation is correct, and that the wilderness claimed another victim through circumstances that may seem mysterious, but ultimately have natural causes. Others are less certain, admitting privately that the combination of evidence in the Webb case does not fit neatly into any conventional explanation. The question remains, what happened to Marcus Webb during those final hours at his campsite? What made those footprints that no expert could identify? What was large enough and bold enough to approach the camp of an armed and experienced outdoorsman? What was he shooting at in those final moments? And perhaps most haunting of all, what was he seeing at the tree line that night, moving closer through the darkness as he wrote his final words? Marcus Webb's body has never been found. His family held a memorial service 6 months after his disappearance, but there was no burial, no physical closure. His case remains technically open, though no active investigation continues. The file sits in archives, another unsolved mystery from America's wild places, another reminder that even in our modern age with our technology and our certainty, there are still things in the wilderness that we do not understand. Those who venture into that section of Big Cypress National Preserve today walk through a landscape that holds its secrets close. The sawgrass stretches endlessly, the cypress trees stand in their ancient formations, and the dark water reflects the sky without revealing what lies beneath. And sometimes, according to those who dare to camp there, you might catch a smell on the wind that makes you think of death and decay. You might feel eyes upon you from the tree line. You might hear something calling in the night that sounds like no animal you have ever known. And you might understand in that moment of primal recognition that you are not alone in the wilderness, that something else shares this space, something that watches and waits and remembers the night it came for Marcus Webb. The evidence sits in storage facilities across the state of Florida, cataloged and analyzed yet remaining stubbornly unexplained. DNA samples collected from hair strands found clinging to tree bark and twisted into chain link fences, samples that have been tested and retested by independent laboratories, samples that consistently return results suggesting primate characteristics that match no known species in any database. The dermal ridges pressed into plaster casts taken from remote swampland show complexity that forensic specialists confirm would be extraordinarily difficult to fabricate. Patterns that mirror the biomechanical requirements of a creature weighing between 600 and 800 pounds, moving through soft terrain. Audio recordings captured on equipment positioned deep in the Everglades contain vocalizations that bioacoustic experts have analyzed frame by frequency, admitting they cannot identify the source among any cataloged animal in North America. This is not scattered folklore or the product of overactive imaginations. This is physical evidence that exists in tangible form, studied by credentialed professionals who stake their reputations on their conclusions. Yet mainstream science remains conspicuously silent, unwilling to seriously investigate despite hundreds of consistent reports spanning not just years but decades. The academic world treats the skunk ape as a cultural curiosity rather than a zoological possibility, even as the evidence accumulates in ways that would prompt immediate investigation if attached to any other phenomenon. The question of ecological viability stands at the heart of the mystery. Could a breeding population of large primates actually survive undetected in Florida's vast wilderness? The mathematics are surprisingly favorable. The Everglades ecosystem alone comprises more than 1.5 million acres of wetlands, hardwood hammocks, and mangrove forests. The Big Cypress National Preserve adds another 720,000 acres of pristine habitat. The Ocala National Forest contributes nearly 400,000 acres of dense pine and swamp. Combined with countless smaller wilderness areas, wildlife management zones, and privately held lands where human presence is minimal or non-existent, Florida contains millions of acres where a small population of large, intelligent primates could theoretically exist with minimal human contact. Biologists acknowledge that we consistently underestimate how much we don't know about species population. Mountain gorillas in Africa were considered possibly extinct before significant populations were discovered in areas previously thought to be thoroughly surveyed. The Saola, a large mammal in Southeast Asia, remained completely unknown to science until 1992, despite its substantial size and presence in regions regularly traversed by humans. If we can overlook a 200-pound antelope in Vietnam, what might we be missing in swamplands, specifically evolved to conceal and obscure? The dietary requirements present less of an obstacle than skeptics assume. Florida's ecosystems produce abundant food sources year-round. Palmetto berries, cabbage palm hearts, various nuts, roots, and fruits would provide plant-based nutrition. The swamps teem with fish, turtles, and small game. Deer populations across the state are robust enough to support significant predation. A small population of omnivorous primates would find ample sustenance without depleting resources in ways that would draw attention. Water sources are unlimited. Cover is dense and continuous across massive territories. The climate eliminates the survival challenges faced by species in northern regions. The environmental conditions support the possibility more readily than they contradict it. Yet the scientific establishment refuses engagement at the level the evidence warrants. Perhaps the refusal stems from something deeper than mere skepticism. There exists a troubling possibility that we don't actually want to find it, that confirming such a creature exists would force uncomfortable questions about what else remains hidden in America's wild spaces. The modern world operates on the assumption that we have cataloged and categorized everything of significance, that the age of discovery ended with satellite imagery and genetic databases. To acknowledge that a large primate species could exist unconfirmed in one of the most populated states in the nation would undermine fundamental assumptions about human knowledge and control over the natural world. The implications extend beyond biology into philosophy and psychology. If the skunk ape is real, it suggests that nature retains secrets despite our surveillance technologies and scientific methodologies. It implies that wilderness still exists in its truest form, harboring mysteries that resist human understanding, not through mystical properties, but through adaptation and the simple vastness of terrain that remains genuinely wild. For a society that believes it has conquered and mapped every corner of the continent, this represents an unsettling reversal of the narrative we tell ourselves about progress and dominion. The latest sighting occurred just months ago in the Big Cypress National Preserve. A wildlife photographer positioning remote cameras to document panther activity discovered tracks measuring 16 inches in length pressed deep into mud near a remote water source. The stride length measured over 6 feet. Nearby vegetation showed signs of something large moving through the understory, palmetto fronds bent and broken at heights, suggesting a bipedal creature significantly taller than any human. Hair samples collected from a broken branch contained that same puzzling DNA signature, primate characteristics with no database match, no clear classification that fits existing taxonomies. Even now, with trail cameras positioned throughout wilderness areas, with satellite imagery capable of counting individual trees, with hikers and hunters carrying smartphones equipped with high-resolution cameras, the technology that promised to eliminate all mystery has instead revealed how vast the unknown territory actually remains. Cameras capture unclear shapes moving between trees. Audio equipment records sounds that resist identification. Physical traces appear and disappear like breadcrumbs leading into deeper wilderness. The cypress shadows hold what they have always held, indifferent to our instruments and immune to our assumptions. Something moves through those spaces where water meets land, where ancient trees create canopies that block the sun and undergrowth grows thick enough to swallow anything that wishes to remain hidden. Whether that something is a remnant population of undocumented primates or something stranger still, the evidence continues to accumulate while science continues to look away, and the swamp continues to keep its counsel, revealing only what it chooses to reveal to those who venture too deep into its green and watching darkness. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.